Welcome to the presentation on the types of neurons and the role of glial cells. The objective today is for you to be able to differentiate between the different types of neurons and the roles that they play in the nervous system, and to identify some of the helper cells. Let's start with the three different types of neurons we're going to be going over. The sensory or the afferent neurons, the motor and the efferent neurons, and the interneurons. So locate that on your worksheet, and you'll be taking notes on these different types of neurons. We're going to start with the sensory or the afferent neurons. Sensory neurons carry messages, because they are sensory neurons, from the body's sense receptors, that means our eyes, our ears, our skin, to the central nervous system. And if you remember, our central nervous system is made up of our brain and our spinal cord. So you can imagine if it's my hand touching something, there's going to be a sensory neuron or an afferent neuron that brings that to my spinal cord, which is part of my central nervous system, up to my brain, the command central. If it's something in my eyes, we're going to have sensory neurons that will actually bring these, they're called cranial nerves, but they're neurons, and they bring them directly to the brainstem. So examples of sensory neurons are neurons that are sitting in the retina, which is in the back of our eye and on our skin. Let's talk about motor neurons. Motor neurons, again, as the name would indicate, they carry messages from the central nervous system to the muscles, the glands, and the organs. And sometimes it's a purposeful action, a voluntary action, like I want you to move your arm, and your brain is sending out that signal, okay, voluntary movement. Other times it's things like your stomach's contracting because it's hungry. Okay, so these are the neurons that carry messages from the central nervous system to the muscles, glands, and organs. And these examples are muscles that are attached to, neurons that are attached to effector muscles. So those are the muscles that contract, such as when you're bending your knee. And those that are attached to organs like your stomach or your uterus that produce contractions. In the example of your stomach, it's when you're hungry, or in the example of the uterus, it's to release eggs from the ovaries. The interneurons are really specialized and yet very prolific. In other words, there are many interneurons, and interneurons exist primarily, actually only, in the central nervous system. So when you think of your central nervous system, your brain, and your spinal cord, it is made up of these interneurons. And they're the ones that enable the communication between your sensory and your motor neurons. They're like that junction between the two. And in the spinal cord, these interneurons play a very vital role in reflexive movement. So these are located, like I said, in the central nervous system and communicate with each other, along with communicating between a sensory and a motor neuron. So in the case of a reflex, think of it this way. You touch something that's hot, and even before that signal makes it to your brain, you're already pulling your hand back from that hot stove, let's say. The reason that happens is because the sensory neurons, those afferent neurons, send the information down through your hand to the spinal cord. It's intercepted by an interneuron, which sends a signal directly back to your hand through motor neurons. Pull that hand back. Meanwhile, those interneurons send that information also to your brain. And then you're like, oh my gosh, I just touched something really hot. Okay, so interneurons have a really important role in the spinal cord for reflexes, but they're also the main communication system in your central nervous system. Here you can see an example of these reflexive movements and responses. This is our spinal cord right here, which is part of our central nervous system. Here's a stimulus, like a hot stove. The receptors on your skin, get a signal that something is hot, and it sends that information through sensory neurons, also known as afferent neurons. And it's going to end up in your brain, but first it starts in your spinal cord. That inner neuron intercepts the message. It will send it to the brain, but it's also going to send a signal to the muscle through these motor neurons. And that effector muscle is going to respond to that. It's going to contract and remove your hand from that hot stove. Let's talk about some of these supporting cells. They're called glial cells, and they do not carry nerve impulses. So, sensory, motor, and interneurons all actually carry a nerve impulse. So, they send signals. But glial cells, or they're called neuroglial cells, they're helper cells. Some people think of them as nerve blue, but they do more than just that. So, and their support role. They do support the neuron. They hold it together. They keep bundles of nerves together. Okay. But they also provide nutrition to the cell and they maintain its integrity. In other words, without some cells, without glial cells, they would actually fall apart. So it's really important, these glial cells, because again, they provide that nutrition. And if we didn't have glial cells, and in fact, those people who suffer from Alzheimer's are suffering from a lack of these types of cells, it can actually damage the neurons. So let's take a look. The only cells that we're going to be looking at that are glial cells in this course are these Schwann cells. And these Schwann cells make up a part of our neuron. And when we get to the neuron, you'll see that these Schwann cells are part of the myelin sheath, which covers and protects the axon of a neuron. So some of that may not make a lot of sense right now, but when we get to the anatomy of a neuron, it will. So here you are, the Schwann cells. But there are many other types of glial cells, support cells, and helper cells in the nervous system. Okay, that is it for the slideshow on the types of neurons and the role of glial cells, which are helper cells. And we will move on to the next piece and make sure you've taken the notes on this, and maybe we'll have a chance to go over these in class.